is coming out this month in June. And it's an incredible book for anybody who has been watching him and listening to his interviews. It'll probably be quite a surprising book because it really expands the thread of what he was talking about, mass formation, totalitarianism, in those interviews into a much broader frame, and really elucidates the context and maybe even the destination of all of this, and perhaps then furthermore what we need to think about doing about it. Just to, for those who don't know, which I think is a diminishing number, Professor Desmet is recognized as one of the world's leading experts on the theory of mass formation as it applies particularly, I think, to the COVID-19 pandemic. He's Professor of Clinical Psychology in the Department of Psychology and Educational Sciences at Ghent University in Belgium, and a practicing psychoanalytic psychotherapist. His interviews have been viewed by millions of people around the world. His previous books include The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology and Lacan's Logic of Subjectivity, A Walk on the Graph of Desire. He is the author of over 100 peer-reviewed academic papers. In 2018, he received the Evidence-Based Psychoanalytic Case Study Prize for the Association of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, and in 2019, he received the Wim Trisberg Prize of the Dutch Association of Psychotherapy. As I was saying there, Professor Desmet, this is really, it's not the kind of book you would expect. It's not a clinical book. It's much more than that. It's not even a psychology book. It's not a book about psychology. It's a book about pretty much the nature of the moment we're in, and indeed about something which has been deeply hidden, perhaps, in our lifetimes, in our culture, that we've heard about before. Going back, we've talked many times in your interviews about Hannah Arendt and Gustave Le Bon and so on, and the mechanics, as it were, of mass formation, as you call it. And we'll get into that a little bit. But this book really seeks to put this in a context that is, I think, broader than anything we've seen before, that it really brings Arendt's and Le Bon's thinking into the present moment, and particularly in the context of the COVID-19, whatever we call it, situation, shall we say. So to begin with, I'd just like to kind of see, well, like, where do you come from into this subject? How did you arrive in this subject? How did you begin to formulate ideas about this general topic, first of all? Was it the COVID-19 thing that triggered it, or had it been something that you had been pursuing in your own thinking for some time?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I started my academic career in 2003, I think, and I was immediately fascinated by the fact that most published research findings are false, as John Ioannidis articulated it in the title of one of his articles. Most published research findings are false. I started to do academic research in the field of psychology, and I immediately had a kind of a dissatisfaction with the research methods used there. And I asked my promoter permission to investigate the research methods themselves. And 4 years later, I presented a PhD in which I claimed that most research methods in psychology cannot else than lead to useless results. And from there on, I started to explore research in other domains as well. And in 2005, there was a happy coincidence. In 2005, the so-called replication crisis started in the sciences, which revealed that over 85% of the published research articles in domains such as the medical sciences could not be reproduced, which actually means that they lack any scientific validity. And I started to write a small book, which you referred to in your introduction, The Pursuit of Objectivity in Psychology, in which I tried to show in an as concrete way as possible why most research methods never can yield valid results or lead to reliable conclusions. And I started to talk about this on all kinds of scientific meetings. And to my surprise, while the examples that I was giving were very concrete and really showed in a very concrete way what the problem was with most research methods, most of my colleagues refused to open their eyes. And to the contrary, they became angry with me. And it was at that moment that I started to be interested in the question as to how it is possible that people can continue to believe in absurd theories or continue to believe in absurd things, even when confronted with clear-cut proof that what they believe in is absurd. And that brought me to the topic of mass formation. So the first part of my academic career, I have a master in clinical psychology, but throughout my PhD, I also got a master in statistics. And in the first part of my academic career, actually, I was constantly involved in statistical research and statistical questions. And at the same time, I was also writing and publishing about more conceptual things, such as Lacanian psychoanalysis and other more conceptual theories. But my focus was, in the first part of my career, was on statistics and on the validity of research methods. But because I noticed that no matter how concrete and how clearly you show that certain research methods are completely absurd, people refuse to open their eyes and see what and see why these methods were absurd. I decided to start to focus on the question: what could make people so blind? And that's how I entered the field of mass psychology. I noticed that probably the only phenomenon, of the only thing that can explain why people in certain situations become radically blind for everything that goes against their own beliefs, or one of the major things that could explain that, is the phenomenon of mass formation. And somewhere back in 2017, I think, I started to lecture on this phenomenon of mass formation and all kinds of other group dynamics as well. And during the Corona crisis, when the Corona crisis set in, I immediately had a feeling that the statistics were wrong. And I started to study the statistics a little bit, all the statistics about the mortality rates of the virus. And I immediately have the impression that, look, these statistics are dramatically overestimating the dangerousness of the virus. And together with me, very remarkable, or even before me, together with me, I think, John Ioannidis of Stanford also claimed like that most statistics in the crisis were blatantly wrong. And John Ioannidis, who had been one of the major scholars investigating the replication crisis in the sciences 15 years before. So I immediately had the impression, like, look, these statistics are wrong. They are dramatically overestimating the dangerousness of the virus. And in my opinion, by the end of May 2020, this was actually proven beyond doubt. By the end of May, the initial models on which the entire corona measures were based were the models of Imperial College in London. And these models predicted that in a small country such as Sweden, over 60,000 people would die if the country didn't go into lockdown. And the country didn't go into lockdown, and in the end, by the end of May 2020, about 6,000 people died. And to arrive at that figure, we even had to count in a very enthusiastic way. That's what they often say. So at that moment, it was clear for everyone who wanted to see it that the initial models indeed dramatically overrated the mortality of the virus. And from then on, while, from the first week of the crisis, I started to speak out in public space. And I wrote an opinion paper in the first week of the crisis, and the title of that paper was "The Fear of the Virus is More Dangerous Than the Virus Itself." And I had exactly the same impression as during the crisis, as during my PhD, when I tried to show people what the problems with the research methods were. Namely, no matter how concretely or how clearly I could show that the statistics that were used in the crisis were wrong. Wait, give me. Sorry for that.
That's all right.
It seemed that nobody wanted to see it. And from then on, I changed my focus, and I decided to try to make people aware of the psychological processes that were going on in society. And in other words, of the huge, large-scale phenomenon of mass formation that was going on in our society during the corona crisis.
Yes. And bringing all of those things together, as you do in the book, this kind of, you identify some kind of almost, what I might call a pathology within science, within what has become more like scientism, and the way that it permeates the world, a certain kind of thinking that seems to be absolute and is taken as absolute, and it is something for experts. Lay people cannot really have an opinion about it or express an opinion about it. So this kind of traps humanity in a certain mind frame which they have no control over, or indeed no authority over. And then this is then, it seems, harnessed in a way that can actually bear down upon them. But there's a really interesting, just to go into this thing about science, which is really fascinating to me. There's an amazing, to me, quote in the very first chapter in the book about science, the nature of science. You say, most are of the opinion that science consists of making dry logical connections between objectively observable facts. However, science is in fact characterized by empathy, a resonant affinity between the observer and the phenomenon under investigation. As such, science stumbles upon an unknowable and mysterious essence that escapes logical explanation and which can be described only in the language of poetry and metaphor. Like that's, to me, it's an amazing insight, and I don't entirely understand it, but I have a feeling, as it were, an empathy that it's somewhere, you know, from my own experience of reading science and listening to scientists, there's always something missing. There's always something that they're trying to elide and to keep a certain path going. And so I'm wondering, like, empathy, in what sense can this, because it seems such a counterintuitive idea in the context of the rationalist age that we live in, that something to do with science could have anything to do with empathy, or that empathy might be a useful tool in apprehending what a scientific proposition might mean.
Yeah, yes. Well, you know, on the one hand, you could see science as a kind of an accumulation of rational knowledge. That's what science does. Science studies the world in a rational way, and throughout the last few hundred centuries, we've seen this accumulation of rational knowledge about a set of phenomena. So that's true. Science is an accumulation of rational knowledge to a certain extent, but at the same time, science is also a process through which, while scientists are following logic and rational understanding, stumble upon the limit of rational understanding. All major scientists have concluded that that part of reality, and I will quote René Thom, one of the most famous mathematicians of the 20th century, literally. René Thom said, this part of reality that can be understood in a rational way is extremely limited. And the rest of reality, he said, we can only know by empathically resonating with it. And, you know, it took me until I was about 35 years old before I really started to understand that indeed what we call the facts, nature around us, everything around us, essentially behaves in an irrational way. And I suddenly understood that while I was studying systems theory, because I was trying to understand what the basis of the measurement problems in the sciences, and I started to study systems theory, and suddenly I stumbled upon this amazing insight that if you look at the complex dynamical system, that you will see that it always behaves, a complex dynamical system, which is like most phenomena in nature, that they intrinsically, they behave in an irrational way. In a paradoxical way, systems theory proved in a strictly rational way that complex dynamical systems are irrational. Literally, that they behave as irrational numbers. That, for instance, that they show no periodicity in their behavior. They never repeat exactly the same pattern, for instance. And even with a formula which determines these systems in your hand, you will never be able to predict how they will behave, not 1 second on the beforehand. So, nature, the core of nature, escapes rational understanding. And that was an insight so profound to me that I think that it changed my life, or the direction of my life. It's also that was what Niels Bohr meant when he said, Niels Bohr, the famous physicist who studied elementary particles, said, when it comes to atoms, language can only be used as poetry. And he was dead serious when he said that. He really meant that the behavior of elementary particles, subatomic particles, is so absurd and can never be grasped by any rational theory of any logical theory, that only poetry can resonate with it. That only through poetry you can understand something, or you can grasp something of this fundamentally strange and irrational behavior of elementary particles. And that's so. We feel a kind of a field of tension between two kinds of knowing, two kinds of knowledge. On the one hand, there is a rational knowledge, a logical knowledge. On the other hand, there is a knowledge that is not really rational, but that is much more a resonating knowledge. I think you could compare it to a craftsman, or to craftsmanship. When someone is trained as a craftsman, in the beginning, he can learn this craft in a rational way. Someone can teach him how the procedures he should use to produce a certain object, for instance. And that's the rational stage of the education, of the training. But after a while, as the training continues and the student is getting better, slowly, he will start to have a certain feeling with what he is doing. He will feel what he is doing, and that's when he really becomes a craftsman. In Japan, there is this wonderful proverb that says, first, you have to protect the rules of an art for a long time, and then you have to break them and leave them behind. And so the first stage is always a rational stage. But this rational stage, the goal or the purpose of this rational stage, this rational understanding, is that it should lead to a different kind of knowing, a much more resonating kind of knowledge, a kind of knowledge that feels the knowledge. And the ancient Greeks also had a specific word to indicate this kind of knowledge. They called it techne, which is a kind of technical knowledge that is more than technical and rational knowledge, that has to do with a kind of a feeling with a certain object that transcends any logical and rational understanding. And the more you understand that, the better you know that the entire project of the Enlightenment, of the tradition of enlightenment, namely to accumulate rational understanding, and this entire belief of the tradition of enlightenment, that rational understanding should be the basis of human living together and of human existence, is an illusion. Rational understanding is extremely volatile. It changes all the time. We can never use rational understanding as the basis of our existence, as the basis for the organization of society. That's impossible. If you try to use rational understanding as the basis to organize human living together, you will end up in a ever varying, always changing, a chaotic set of rules, which will destroy ultimately all humanity in society. And that's exactly what happens in a totalitarian system. That's exactly the problem of a totalitarian system. It tries to rely on a kind of pseudo-rational ideology, which in the end creates a chaotic state in which all humanity is destroyed.
Sorry, yes, it's a very beautiful thesis, and it does clearly, resonate with what's happening now, and in terms of, offering a critique and maybe an alternative way of seeing the world, which would be at least a start. However, it also appears at this moment in the prison that we have created for ourselves of rational thinking, or pseudo-rational thinking, as you would see it, that it seems to describe a parallel universe, that it seems to describe something that is unattainable, because our idea increasingly, encroachingly in our societies, our cultures, is that this rational form of science is absolute and, unassailable and non-negotiable, and that it is actually naturalistic, that it is actually organic, it is actually the truth, it is reality, and therefore the best that you can do in a certain sense is to scratch at the knees of this model with this different kind of thinking, because it's almost impossible to imagine a trajectory into the future in which we would correct the present trust. What is your, is that an excessively pessimistic view, or do you think there are signs that we might be on the verge? I mean, I know we're jumping to the end of the discussion in a sense here, but I think before we go back, it's important to set out this, because, I think it's a very beautiful part of your book, and the whole thesis that you've expressed about this is really, really, I think, hopeful and enlightening for people.
Mm. Yes, well, I think that what you witness now is the emergence of a technocratic system, a technocratic society, which is no longer led by democratically elected politicians, but by technical experts. We witness the emergence of such a society, and we very soon will witness the collapse of this society. And in this period, I think it will be proven and it will become clear to everyone that rational knowledge is highly relative, that you can never use it as the guiding principle in a society. And then now the democratically elected leaders are replaced by technical leaders. We have seen it actually during the Corona crisis, where the true leaders of society were no longer the politicians, it were the experts. When the experts said we should do this or that to prevent the spread of the virus, then the politicians could only obey, because if they would go against the expert, they could be held responsible for the deaths of everyone who died of the virus, or just because they had this hubris to think they knew better what the virus could do than the experts. So, and the same we will see now in Belgium. We have this new committee of experts now, which will have to guide us through the economic crisis, the emergent economic crisis, and it will be the same story, of course. If these economic experts think that we should take this or that measure to counter the economic crisis, what politician will pretend that he knows better than the experts what they have to do? Of course, he might know it better, but in our current view on man and the world, it's just logical that society should be led by technocratic experts. I think that as soon as we adopted this mechanistic, rationalist view on man and the world, believing that the entire universe is a kind of a material machine that functions according to the laws of mechanics, and that can be understood and described in a strictly rational way, as soon as you take this as your starting point, as soon as you start from this view on man in the world, the logical conclusion is that a technical expert who knows the material machine should lead society. Why not? Why would you ask a democratically elected politician, a politician that is elected by the crowd, who is stupid and irrational? Why would you believe that such a politician would be the best leader when we are confronted with a crisis, an economic crisis, or no matter what crisis? What we are facing now is the ultimate and logical consequence of this mechanist, rationalist view on man in the world that started to become dominant from the 16th century onwards. Now, we see the logical conclusion, namely, we should give the lead of society in the hands of technical experts who have the rational knowledge to know how to repair the machine, so to speak. And yes, and now at this moment, at the same time, we will see that this system will fail. We've seen it in the Corona crisis, actually, that it's doomed to fail ultimately, but we'll see it even clearer as it continues. And then I think that after that period, we will be ready for a new type of leader, I think. A new type of leader who does no longer pretend that he can lead society on the basis of rational understanding, but who went through a prolonged, long period of rational training and who could then transcend his rational understanding and arrive at something that the ancient Greeks called truth speech. Truth speech. My next book will be about truth speech, about the concept, the contrast. I'm writing it now. The contrast between indoctrination, propaganda on the one hand, and truth speech on the other hand. And this truth speech, the ancient Greeks distinguished between 4 kinds of truth speech: prophecy, wisdom, techne, and something they call parasia, which is a kind of courageous, bold speech in public space. And these were the 4 types of truth speech. And all these 4 types of truth speech were characterized all by the fact that you cannot reduce them to rational understanding or rational speech. Prophecy, wisdom, techne, and parasia are 4 types of truth speech which are not irrational, but which transcend rationality, because the speaker is in touch in a resonating way with the object he's talking about. That's truth speech. And that should be the guiding principle in society. We should reappreciate the phenomenon of truth, not in a naive way, not as the fact checkers do now, who seem to believe that they have all the facts in their pocket and that they can just compare every statement to the fact. No, truth is something completely different. Truth has to do with the capacity to resonate with the object you're talking about and to speak in a way that transcends all rational understanding. That should...
Sorry. I think we already had a leader like that, and it was a very interesting thing to observe, as it were, as a kind of maybe an early experiment in what you're talking about. And that was the experience of Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic. Because he had this idea of creating what he called post-political politics, which would be very much like, this is the way he used to talk about things a little bit, you know. But unfortunately, when
in what book? You know that? Can you tell me in what book?
Yes, he wrote there was a book called The Power of the Powerless, is one of his most famous essays, and Living in Truth, an essay he wrote, a book of essay. He wrote an essay to the then president of Czechoslovakia, explaining many of these very concepts. And just to tell the story then to the end, I mean, it's a kind of a tragic story in a way, because he became president himself. And he then at the end wrote a book about being president called To the Castle and Back, which is really kind of a diary of his presidency. And it's quite a downbeat book, you know, I mean, because he's more or less describing himself being swamped by bureaucracy and ritualistic kind of behaviors as the president. And that he spends most of his time writing speeches which he has delivered himself, because he doesn't trust anybody to write speeches to express himself. Nobody else can do it, and so on. So, you know, in that sense, it almost seems that in the present age, at least, the conditions that you're talking about, of this as well in a moment. But defeat in a sense, and he and of our time, of what you say, the attempt of famous essay, in that particular essay, I think, Power of the Powerless, where he describes in the communist era, in the middle there's a sign that says, "Workers of the world unite." And he analyzes the meaning of this sign in the context of the greengrocer's window. What does it actually mean? Well, it's just a kind of something, it's a mechanism to deflect the attention of the regime away from the greengrocer, essentially, to stop them, you know, asking him why he's not furthering the revolution and so on and so on. So it's exactly what you're talking about. And it brings us really to the context that you talk about, because totalitarianism, you know, the word means to people, I think, really, it's a synonym, they think, for authoritarianism. But of course, that isn't what it is at all. And the way you describe it is very far from that. And it seems also to be, well, okay, as a layperson, I will try and sort of then sketch out where I see what you've described. It's like I would say perhaps a pathology of modernity of some kind, of the rationalist thinking you describe. Also, I would say, possibly you don't go into this too deeply, but the whole idea of mass media and the effects of the various media on the consciousness of the person. The generation then of a mob mind that isn't visible, that is present, that people are not aware of being part of, but they are part of it, that it saturates their thinking, that their thinking is all received, that kind of thing. And that then, that I'm very interested in the way you talk about the symbiotic relationship between the leaders and the led, because it's different dynamic entirely to that of the authoritarian dictator and the subject, as it were. So I think, to go back, now you have described very well how in the kind of mechanistic society we have, that these various symptoms like atomization and alienation and, you know, free-floating anxieties and what you call bullshit jobs, like so many people are doing jobs that don't satisfy them and so on, that these are create a ripeness of the possibility of totalitarianism and of these kind of so can you in a general sense offer a diagnosis of totalitarianism? Because we have Hannah Arendt talking about it back in the early, I think, 50s, 70 years ago. It has changed. The conditions, the underfoot conditions have changed radically since then, haven't they? I mean, she got the essence of it. She was talking, but when you think about it, Hitler and Stalin, they were almost like, I would say, somewhere on a transitional phase between the authoritarian and the totalitarian model. Would you agree with that? It seems that yes. But they had, for example, but other than that, there was nothing like what we have now, which is like minute-to-minute connections between the leaders and the led, and between the mass of people themselves, fermenting and fomenting their groupthink or their mass thought patterns.
Yeah, of course. Yes, in this book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, I focus on the formation of the masses themselves. In what way? I was fascinated by the question: why mass formation? Why the masses or the crowds became stronger and stronger and stronger throughout the last few centuries? And then that has been observed and described by many scholars, but nobody really explained why. they became stronger and stronger and stronger. So, and that was a major challenge of my book, like trying to understand why the masses became stronger. And I had some indications. People like Hannah Arendt, for instance, pointed out already that it had something to do with the fact that there were more and more people who lived in a disconnected state, in an anatomized state. They felt disconnected from their natural and social environment, and that in one way or another made them vulnerable to more vulnerable to mass formation, to the phenomenon of mass formation. But the ultimate cause, in my opinion, is this mechanistic view on men in the world. It's clear that it is the mechanistic view on men in the world that in itself disconnects people already from their environment. When you think in a logical way, you connect one logical idea to the other, and you literally build a kind of wall around you, which isolates you from the real object that is out there. You reduce every object on the beforehand already to the categories of your own logical thinking. And that's, in this way, you end up in a kind of a mental prison without knowing it. You constantly believe that the categories of your own thinking will be sufficient to truly understand what is outside of you. And so that's the first step. Mechanistic thinking, rationalist thinking in itself has already a disconnecting and an isolating effect. I describe that in much more detail in my book. But then in a second step, starting from this mechanistic thinking, we manipulated the world, we industrialized, mechanized the world. We started to use, in a very excessive way, technology. And that, I give several examples in my book to show that almost every step forward in the direction of industrialization, mechanization, and the use of technology leads to a reduction of the connection between the human being and its environment. And it's this disconnected state, this atomized state, to use a word that was also used by the Frankfurter Schule and by Hannah Arendt, is this disconnected state that makes people vulnerable for mass formation, and is this mass formation that leads to totalitarianism. So, because the difference between a totalitarian state and classical dictatorship is exactly this, that a classical dictatorship is extremely simple from a psychological point of view. People are just scared of a small regime, for the aggression of a small regime. And but a totalitarian state is based on the phenomenon of mass formation. So first there is this mass that emerges in a society, which is fanatically in the grip of a certain ideology or a certain narrative. And then there are some leaders of the mass that can use the masses, the crowd, to seize control over the state apparatus. That's one part of the story. There is a second one, of course, and that's something that I will describe in much more detail in my next book. And it is that, on the one hand, throughout the last centuries, the phenomenon of mass formation became increasingly strong. The masses became larger, lasted longer, became stronger, because the conditions for mass formation were more and more met, were more and more fulfilled in society. There was more and more loneliness, more and more disconnectedness, more and more lack of meaning making, more and more freely floating attention, frustration, aggression. And that was what prepared society for larger and larger phenomenon of mass formation. That's true as the one aspect of totalitarianism, but there is a second one, of course, and it is that we also saw a specific development at the level of the elite. The elite became smaller and smaller, had more and more means at its disposal to manipulate the population. Mass media is a necessary ingredient for every long-term phenomenon of mass formation. Mass formation usually will not last very long if the masses are not constantly re-hypnotized through the mass media by the same messages time and time again.
Yes. The concept of hypnosis is it's very interesting, because you say it's identical to mass formation, I think, more or less, right? But it's again a counterintuitive idea. People find it really hard when you try to explain to it that, because they think of hypnosis as either being a very deep state created by some expert, or a game that people play, a kind of a fun kind of show, you know, just for laughs. They don't really kind of understand, and I don't understand what hypnosis really is at its core. And I have friends who are hypnotists, and they cannot explain it to me really particularly well. Do you first of all understand like what hypnosis is of its essence?
Yeah.
What is the state we're transported to in hypnosis? And I mean, have you ever either done hypnosis or been hypnotized? Have you got that close to it?
I've not been hypnotized, but I once hypnotized someone without knowing it. I will tell you the story. First, I think I can describe in a very precise way what the mechanism of hypnosis is. But let me first give a concise description of the phenomenon of mass. No, I will start with hypnosis. Okay, like in a hypnotic procedure is actually very simple. It's just someone, a hypnotist, who has a natural skill to withdraw, to detach people's attention, someone's attention or someone's psychological energy, you could say, from the environment, to withdraw it and to focus it all on one small aspect of reality, which can be an object that is swinging on a small chain, or just a set of representations or ideas that are presented by the hypnotist. And once the hypnotist could take someone's attention away from the environment and focus it on one small point, something very strange happens. It is as if all the rest of reality stops to exist. And you simply have to think about this in terms of, well, it's all the energy that is withdrawn from all the mental representations of reality and all focused and attached to one small set of representations. That's what happens in a hypnotic procedure. And this effect is extremely strong. Once people's attention is focused on that one small aspect of reality, even the strongest stimuli that are outside of that small focus of attention or not seem not to exist anymore. And for instance, a simple hypnotic procedure is sufficient to make one completely insensitive to pain. I've seen this with my own eyes, how a professor who also was a hypnotist focuses the attention of a patient in a hospital so much on one positive mental representation that a surgeon can start to perform a surgical operation, can start to cut through the skin, through the flesh, even cut straight through the breastbone to perform an open heart operation without the patient noticing it. And the procedure is really extremely simple. This professor hypnotist said something like, okay, again to the patient, he was talking in the following way. Well, we will go together to a place that you like very much. Okay, do you feel the sun on your skin? Do you feel the sand under your feet? And then while he was talking like this, he suddenly gave a sign to the surgeon, you can start. And then the surgeon could cut straight through the flesh and the bones of the patient. The patient didn't notice it. And one time, I was talking about this during a lecture at university, and one of my students just dropped down from her chair. And I first didn't know what was going on. And I went to her, asked her what happened. She didn't understand me. She was just out of consciousness. And suddenly I said, well, then I will call a doctor. And she suddenly woke up and she said, okay, it's okay. I will go back to my chair. She went back to her chair, and I started I continued with my story. So I said, well, we will go together to a place that you like very much. Do you feel the sun on your skin, the sand under your feet? And she dropped from her chair again. And I then realized that she was hypnotized. So hypnosis is a very strange phenomenon. It's very simple. It can happen in a very spontaneous way. It just means that someone can attract all the attention and focus it on one small aspect of reality, and then all the rest disappears. And that's exactly the same happens in a mass formation. Exactly the same. It's exactly the same.
And in what say, so how would it work in a mass formation?
Okay,
Is TV the primary instrument? Is there more to it than that? Is it propaganda in general? How does that work?
TV, radio, doesn't matter. The most important thing is that, the population should be in a very specific condition to provoke a large-scale mass formation. And the core characteristic of this condition is that many people should feel disconnected, should feel lonely. And that was definitely the case just before the Corona crisis. There was over 30% of the people worldwide who reported that they didn't have one meaningful relationship and that they only connected to other people through the internet. So that's a core condition, this disconnectedness. And then once people feel disconnected, they will typically experience a lack of meaning making in life. And that was also definitely the case. 60% of the people reported that they considered their own job to be a bullshit job. So that they didn't know what the purpose of the job was. And then once people feel disconnected and suffer from a lack of meaning making, they will typically be confronted with freely floating anxiety, frustration, and aggression. That means that all their affects and emotions, all their psychological energy will detach from their mental representations. They will start to feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive without knowing what they feel anxious, frustrated, and aggressive for. And that's an extremely aversive mental state. Just because if you are anxious, but you don't know what you're anxious for, you feel out of control. You cannot protect yourself from your anxiety. You don't know what you can run away from. And in this state, something very specific might happen. So at that moment, we are in the first stage of the hypnosis. That means all the psychological energy and attention is withdrawn from the environment. It's freely floating. And if people are in this condition and a narrative is distributed or disseminated through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety, and at the same time providing a strategy to deal with this object of anxiety, then all this freely floating anxiety might suddenly connect to the object of anxiety, and there might be a huge willingness to participate in a strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, just because in this way, people feel that they have a little bit of control again over their anxiety. They can connect it to something and they can fight it with this strategy. For instance, a virus as the object of anxiety and the lockdown as a strategy to fight the object of anxiety, or a witch as the object of anxiety and the witch trials as the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. All major mass formations, whether we are talking about the Crusades, the witch hunts, the French Revolution, the Nazism or communism, all major mass formations follow the same mechanism. First, people were in the specific mental state, then someone put forward an object of anxiety and a strategy to deal with it, and consequently, there was like a huge willingness to participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety. And the first advantage, psychological advantage, of course, is that people can control their anxiety in a better way and that they have an object for all their frustration and aggression. And that's the first step. And then in a second step, something even more important happens, because many people at the same time participate in the heroic battle with the object of anxiety. People feel connected again. They just feel connected again. And that's the real reason why people buy into the narrative. Not because they think it's right or accurate or no matter what. It's because it leads to this new social bond and because it allows to direct all this frustration and aggression at something, and because it allows to control the anxiety of the people. So that's the mechanism. And the problem, of course, with the mechanism is that this new social bond is never a social bond between individuals. It's a social bond between every individual separately and the collective. So the mass or a crowd is a group that is formed not because the individuals show a strong solidarity with each other. No, because each individual separately shows a strong solidarity with the collective. And that's the longer a mass formation exists, the more all the psychological energy is sucked away from the relationships between individuals and is invested in the relationship between the individual and the collective. Meaning that, and that's why during the Corona crisis, for instance, while everybody was talking about solidarity, people did accept that if someone got an accident on the street, they were no longer allowed to help him unless they had a surgical mask and surgical gloves at their disposal. That the websites of the Belgian and the Dutch government, the European government, all mentioned it like that. And that's also why, at the same time, why people accepted that if their parents were dying, they were no longer allowed to visit them. No, they should die alone. So that's this strange solidarity, the solidarity in a mass. Is a solidarity with a collective ideal and never solidarity with other individuals. And that's of course why in every totalitarian state, which is always based on mass formation, ends up in a radically paranoid atmosphere in which every individual is willing to report other individuals to the state. Not every individual, about 30% of the individuals usually. I've had this conversation with a woman who lived in Iran during the revolution in 1979, and she told me that when this revolution was a large-scale phenomenon of mass formation in Iran, and she told me how she witnessed with her own eyes how a mother reported her son to the state, and how she hung the rope around his neck just before he was hung, and how she claimed to be a heroine for doing so. And that's so typical. Even the strongest relationships between individuals deteriorate in a mass formation and inevitably become less strong than the relationship between the individual and the collective. That's mass formation, totalitarianism and mass formation, or extreme examples of collectivism. Usually,
yeah, there seems to be this paradox that on the one hand they suck people into the crowd, into the bubble of thinking of the crowd, or the bubble of feeling more, is it really, that it's a kind of, because it seems to be a low level of thought in the sense in general, that it's like a very, very superficial, simplistic and pious form of thinking, you know, that it's very hard in its responses, moralistic responses and so on. But at the same time, it seems to drive people into themselves in a different way and isolate them even more from each other than normal life. So is there, I mean, I think, is it true to say, Professor, that we generally, our culture does not understand how the extent to which our individuality is very much all the time merging and morphing with crowds and with commonality of thinking and so on, that's a kind of unexplored area in terms of, because there's an assumption in our culture that we're individuals. When we speak as ourselves. It's my opinion, you know, this is your opinion. We exchange our opinions, we have discussions and debates, but in reality we're actually acting within, and very often within, a mass, which is acting out roles which are allocated within that mass.
Definitely. We all thinking and speech became much more uniform throughout the last century, without people knowing it, because people all are in the grip of the same propaganda and the same narratives that are distributed through the mass media. People such as Trotter, Lippmann, Bernays, the founding fathers of modern public relations, which is a type of propaganda, all explain that the purpose of propaganda is to make everyone think in the same way. They were all, you know, yeah. So of course, while we believe that we become more rational and that we think for ourselves, we actually more and more increasingly start to think in the same way. That's also interesting, that the higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people are for mass formation. And that's exactly because education, what we call education now, the school system, is actually one kind of propaganda. Jacques Ellul, one of the most prolific and most intelligent writers about the phenomenon of propaganda, said that without our educational system, propaganda wouldn't be successful. We very often tend to think that our educational system learns people to think in a critical and rational way. But in the first place, it learns everybody to think in the same way, I think. And that's so dramatic. It's so clear that the higher the level of education, that was described in the 19th century already by such people as Gustave Le Bon, that the higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people are for mass formation. The more.
And why that is? Like, is it because you know, the specialization, the compartmentalization of disciplines and specialities that create experts in a singular area, but that there isn't necessarily any connectivity between that area and the broader world, or with other disciplines? For example, it's interesting that you have not just psychology, but you know, statistical experience, training as well, and perhaps that was a factor that allowed you somehow to break out of this singular epistemology of the world that perhaps afflicts a lot of scientists and experts in other areas. What do you think of that?
I don't know. It can have many reasons, I think. Why more highly educated people are more vulnerable for mass formation can have many reasons, I think. It can have to do with the effect of education on the way people think, but it could also be a selection effect. It could also be that the more people want to conform to socially shared ideals and group ideals shared by the group, the longer and the more they will do their best to get a degree, and the longer they will remain in the educational system. I don't know actually why more highly educated people are more vulnerable. It's hard to say. Maybe yes, the fact that education is much more and more fragmented and focused can be a reason. But I don't think that, for instance, the fact that I continue to speak out or swim against the tide, I'm not sure. I don't think it has something to do with the fact that I have a double degree.
Not necessarily that, but that you are not a special. You're not a singular specialist. That your range of attention varies across the spectrum of ideas. I think that's merely the duality of the two degrees will be simply a symptom of that, but that it's a different way of seeing the world. It's almost like, you know, if you have only one language, you know, but if you can learn a second language as a child, it becomes easier to learn other languages when you're older. Even just having those two languages, whatever the other language is.
Okay. Yes, maybe. Yes.
The process of comparison or something allows for a multiplicity of understandings or possibilities to enter in for the meaning of words and the meaning of concepts. You know, I don't know, it's something like that perhaps. Yeah. But the mass formation thing, I mean, the elite and the, as we call it, and the mass, I'm very interested in your whole thesis about this, because it in some ways it seems to kind of, it goes against the grain of a lot of the understandings that have, you know, risen up in the last couple of years about, you know, kind of a very highly manipulative elite, control, puppet mastering the world and running the whole thing. And you describe a process that really is potentially much more organic, that it really erupts organically from the context that you have described, and that in a sense it isn't really accurate or reliable to see it as simply, you know, the Illuminati or the cabal manipulating everything on some kind of downward pyramid of control that operates on a series of handing over of power and authority and instructions downwards.
No, no.
Do you like? Can you elaborate on that? Because that would, I think, be against certainly a lot of people watching this, or a lot of these kind of broadcasts would probably have a different view than that. Are you saying that, in fact, I don't think you're saying that, in fact, there is no possibility of some overarching kind of influence on this, but that it isn't actually enough to make it work? Something like that, is it? I'm not sure.
Well, I think one thing is sure, that of course there is an elite, and of course there are institutions who have ideological plans they want to impose to society. There are all kinds of influential people who dream of reshaping society according to a technocratic or transhumanist ideal. All that truly exists, I think. But even then, we can conceive the role played by the elite in very different ways. I believe that both the root cause of the problem we are dealing with now is not the elite. That's so typical for a totalitarian system. Even while the elite is manipulative and has a huge propaganda machinery at its disposal, and so on and so on, the strange thing is that it doesn't make sense to try to destroy the elite. At least if you destroy a part of the elite, the problem won't be solved. The elite will just be replaced and the system will continue as if nothing happened. That's one of the major differences with the classical dictatorship. In a classical dictatorship, if you destroy a part of the dictatorial elite, usually the system collapses, the dictatorship collapses. If in a totalitarian system you destroy a substantial part of the totalitarian elite, it just continues. That's what Stalin perfectly knew. He perfectly knew that he could eliminate, liquidate 60% of his own Communist Party members, that they would just be replaced and that the system would continue as if nothing happened. And that's just because the point of gravity of a totalitarian system is not in the elite, it's in the masses, or in the diabolic pact, as Hannah Arendt said, between the masses and their leaders. So the root cause of the problem is not one or another elite. It's this ideology. It's the ideology, in the end, ultimately, this mechanist ideology that not only prepared the population for mass formation in the way that I just described, but that also prepared an elite for their totalitarian role. So the only thing that can truly allow us to overcome the problem, the symptom of totalitarianism, is to change is the emergence of a new view on man and the world. The emergence of a new view on man and the world that goes beyond, that transcends this rationalist view on man and the world. Ultimately, that's the only way, that's the only thing we can do.
Yes.
And it's clear. Like, that's also a problem with most types of conspiracy thinking, that it is as if all the evil in the world is concentrated in a small elite, which manipulates and steers the world from behind the curtain and from the dark. But everybody, Solzhenitsyn articulated this or described this in a very beautiful quote. He said, "The line dividing good and evil. It would be easy to believe that the line dividing good and evil run between people, but it runs through every human heart." And that's true. Everybody in us has a bit of evil, a bit of good, and we are all struggling and suffering. The one is more evil than the other, of course. But I think it makes no sense to believe that all the evil in the world is due to a small elite. No, there is this elite. If you look at the way in which the elite emerged, for instance, if you look the founding, if you read the books written by the founding fathers of propaganda, then you see that they all believed that they did that they developed their propaganda machinery for the better good. They all believe that if you don't manipulate the population, it will be self-destructive, it will be irrational, and so on. They believe that the masses had to be manipulated in order to prevent them to end up in radical destructiveness and radical irrationality. And in a certain way, that's true, that masses have a tendency to self-destroy and to be self-destructive and to be irrational. But of course, I really don't believe that propaganda and manipulation is the right solution to that problem. That's where I differ from these people such as Lippmann, Trotter, Bernays, and from totalitarian leaders, of course.
Yes, and also there seems to be a tendency in the masses or the ordinary individual to enter into kind of Faustian pacts with power for the sake of convenience. For example, like the mobile phone, you know, which is now used as an instrument of that, despite the fact that people are aware of the dangers of it, the convenience of it is too tempting and too seductive for them to say, no, we won't use it anymore. Absolutely. That seems to be a paradox of our desiring to retain our freedoms while at the same time wanting to retain all of the baubles of technical civilization.
Yeah, indeed, exactly. Mechanist thinking has this enormous grip on the population, on everyone, leaders and followers, because it always promises to make life more comfortable and more easy in the short term. And that makes us forget that it takes away something of the essentials and the core of our lives and of humanity in the longer term. That's a strange thing. Mechanist thinking, that's how mechanist thinking seduces the human mind. It always promises more control over the world. It will make our life easier. Every new technological device seems to make our life easier, more comfortable, and so on. And that makes us blind for the fact that it also takes something away. It comes with a price. And yes, this price is always that it destroys more and more our truly human connection, our resonating connection with everything around us.
What do you think is it that enables a small minority of people to somehow remain immune to this thinking? I mean, you talk about is it the Ash test, where the one section of the people are absolutely certain they know what the line is, they know what is the correct answer, and they're not sucked into the trick. But what is it that makes that? Have you identified any characteristics in those people that can be said to be a generalization even?
No, it has probably something to do with with ideological preferences. If the narrative that leads to the mass formation, if the ideological basis that leads to the narrative that leads to the mass formation is not in line with your own ideological preferences, you probably will be more resilient and you probably will be less sensitive for the phenomenon of mass formation. But that doesn't explain everything, because someone like Meerlo, who wrote this wonderful book, or very interesting book, The Rape of the Mind, on totalitarianism and on propaganda, indoctrination, brainwashing and stuff, said how he described how he observed just before the Second World War how certain people who before the emergence of Nazism in Europe were very critical for all kinds of race theories and all this Nazist discourse, how they suddenly, when the Nazist party became the dominant party, suddenly started to think in a different way. They suddenly start to see the advantages of this kind of ideology. And that's what there's a phenomenon that Mirlo calls the rape of the mind, showing that ideological preferences definitely do not explain everything. As to answer the question, why some people go along with the masses and why other people do not fall prey to the process of mass formation. I think that in the end, it all depends on the most fundamental choice a human being can make. As a human being, we constantly have to choose between going along with the largest group of people, the dominant group, dominant thinking in society, or we can try to stay loyal to something that we consider sincere, honest, truthful, and taking the more difficult road, in which we have to swim against the tide, in which we have to go against the current. That's a very fundamental choice, probably the most fundamental choice a human being can make. And if throughout your life you preferred the second type of satisfaction, namely, in one way or another, staying true to something you truly consider sincere and honest and so on, I think if you make that choice enough, if you can stay in touch with what you believe is true, then you might have a better chance to escape the phenomenon of mass formation when it emerges around you, and to stay awake. That might be that's the only thing. You know, this question has been asked throughout the last 200 years. It has been asked so often. So many people have wondered, like, what the hell makes that a small group of people is not vulnerable for mass formation? Because in every major mass formation, it was clear that there was a small group or a certain percentage of the population that was immune to it. But nobody has really succeeded in explaining it.
One possible theory is that it has something to do with, you know, the residue of religion in a post-religious society. That the totalitarian phenomenon seems to be a kind of a eruption of post-Christian, post-religious societies in many respects. And I've certainly noticed in this context of the COVID thing that many of the people on the dissident side tend to be religious people of various kinds, very intensely religious people in many instances, but maybe with a particular kind of an anthropological insight into things. And so that in a certain sense, what they're confronted by in this mass formation and in the whole tyrannical aspects of COVID is so counter to what their fundamental beliefs are telling them about their humanity, the dignity of the human person, and the freedom of the human person, and so on. That's actually the trigger that galvanizes these people. And I was interested in that concept because, in the context of your book and in the Psychology of Totalitarianism, you a lot of the time, I mean, it isn't a religious prognosis or anything like that. I don't think you would put it like that at all. But nevertheless, your solutions are moving towards the mystical area. They're, you know, what used to be, what, as it were, the kind of pre-religion religiosity of the human race, the desiring of human beings for a more exalted state of being in the world. But that's what you're describing, even though I'm not trying to characterize it as any way a religious prescription. It isn't, but it's nevertheless into that area, and also into the area of, you know, because poetry, as it were, the poetic mindset, you know, the two things, religion or spirituality, shall we say, and poetry, they're very much allied in that area. And yet both are in decline in a certain sense in our culture, the mainstream of our culture now, because, and maybe that's got to do with the mechanistic, it has to do with the mechanistic worldview and all of that. But I wonder, what would you say about that whole area? Because, you know, it seems that the big problem of our age, insofar as religion is concerned, is that our rationality has made it impossible for many people to believe in the kind of mythology, shall we say, that their parents and grandparents took for granted, and which functioned as a way of enabling their whole existences to run in a particular way and to accept certain realities and to, move through reality with a certain certitude that isn't available now to people.
Yes, I think that religion, mysticism, poetry are 3 examples of practices or kind of discourses that transcend rationality. Max Planck, so the famous physicist who also won the Nobel Prize, wrote something wonderful about this. He said, "I've dedicated my life to science and to scientific research in the laboratory. And I came to the firm conclusion," he said, "that in the end, science arrives where religion once started, in an original contact with something that transcends rationality." And he called that something that transcends rationality a personal God. And the difference is, he said, that for a religious person, he said, God is the basis of everything. And for a scientist, he said, God is the conclusion of everything. It means that for Max Planck, he said, if you really follow the rational mind, the rationality, the ratio, in a honest and loyal way, in the end, you will arrive at the point where you will see that you arrive at the border, at the limit of rationality. And then, beyond that point, there is something that never can be understood in a rational way, but it is alive, it speaks, you can resonate with it, and it will make you see things constantly in a different way. And that's how Max Planck, describes it. So I believe that I don't think we can go back to institutionalized dogmatic religion. That wouldn't be a solution. But the original religious experience is probably the same as the kind of experience the mysticists were talking about. It's probably the same as the kind of experience Max Planck was talking about. And it's every time it's the same experience. It's an experience with something that transcends all rational understanding, and that that touches you in the core of your being. And the crucial precondition to experience this kind of knowing, this kind of resonance, is, I think, that you accept the limitations of your own logical, rational understanding. That's a crucial precondition. It is at the moment, I experienced this very clearly in my own life, it is at the moment that you become aware of the fact that your logical understanding will never grasp the essential, the core of life. It is at that moment that almost literally, that all these logical ideas that you are connecting to one another, that they will never be sufficient to teach you what life is and what the core of our existence is. And it is at this moment that we can stop to obsessively try to understand in a logical way, that all these logical ideas that were connected with each other open up, and that literally something of the eternal music of life that vibrates in everything around you can go through the logical wall and can touch the strings of your own being and can make you resonate with the eternal music of things around you. Almost literally. In my book, I compare the human body and to a certain extent the human consciousness as well with a string instrument. Almost literally. The muscles that are on the skeleton are all on a certain tension. And they are capable of resonating with a certain frequency outside of us. And the more we are aware and we can accept the limitations of logics and logical understanding, and the less we need an ego, an identification with an visual self-image, the less we invest our energy in the ego, and the less we need logical thinking to protect ourselves from the mystery of life,
Yes.
the more we are capable of resonating with something eternal around us. And that's the moment when we receive this other kind of knowledge, which connects us to the essence of life, and which also makes that we can tolerate better and better the idea of dead and dying, for instance. That's something that I notice. As soon as you start to develop this resonating knowledge, you feel that you're part of something eternal, and death is not so, well, the idea of that you once will stop, that your life will stop, that your life will end, is not as unbearable anymore. So, well, yeah.
Yes. The word used in there, one of the words, mystery. It has always seemed to me, or for a long time it has seemed to me, that our culture misses this entirely. That all of us, we live in a mysterious reality, which is, even to the scientists, each scientist in his own way has a certain knowledge, but no matter how large or broad that is, it's minuscule as compared to the total mystery of reality. And of course, the layperson it's multiple times that. And indeed, that mystery then extends into ourselves, to our very being, our minds, or what is the mind, and so on, so on. And yet we pretend, we objectify the world and objectify ourselves, pretend that we understand everything now because Charles Darwin told us how it all worked, or whatever, So, and it seems to me that this is caused a huge space to open up in the human person in modern culture, that part of the mystery is being denied. The part that is mysterious, part of everything that is mysterious, is being denied, and that we carry around this gaping hole in ourselves that we are not allowed to think about or to talk about or to dismiss. And I mean, even the idea now of religion has become problematic in that area, in that context, because as soon as you start to touch on what sound like religious ideas, the alarm bells start to go off all over the place, and people become edgy, because they think you're trying to preach to them or proselytize or whatever. And so it seems that increasingly humanity is becoming ripe for all kinds of manipulation, for anything that will fill that hole that they don't even know exists.
Definitely. Yes, of course.
So what then? You talk about the way man would live in the world. I mean, do you think it's a realistic proposition? I mean, I'm not asking you to put a time frame on it, but can you envisage that kind of a shift in culture, or do you see signs that we are already coming to the end of this phase? You seem to suggest that this will burn itself out, or it will blow up.
It will. It will. That's a cynical advantage of all totalitarianism and mass formation, that it is always self-destructive. In the end, it always becomes, to use the words of Hannah Arendt, a monster that devours its own children. So that's true. When that will happen, nobody knows. And my gut feeling tells me that it will last 7 or 8 years or something. But actually, that's just my gut feeling. I have no idea why I think it could be 7 or 8 years. But I also think that maybe we shouldn't lose too much energy trying to predict how exactly things will evolve and what exactly will happen. It's probably better to focus on the only thing that we can be sure of, and that we can be certain of, namely that we will stick and that we will stay loyal to our own principles, the principles, to certain ethical principles, the principles of humanity, because that's what this resonating knowledge allows us, I think. It makes that we can feel the eternal principles of humanity again. Principles are something that can never be articulated or grasped in logical formulations in a definitive way. We also need to reinvent them, to reformulate them, to re-articulate them. And I think that this resonating knowledge can allow us to feel what the important principles are that are crucial and essential for a human, for a life that is truly human. And it is these principles, not so much rational understanding, but it is these principles that can be the true guiding forces in a truly human society. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Yes.
The guy who wrote this, his book is here on my desk. The guy who wrote this wonderful book, The Gulag Archipelago.
See, I have him here as well.
Yes. Well, Solzhenitsyn describes in a certain chapter how in the concentration camps, in the gulags, I don't know, I think he has been in the gulags for 15 years or something, at least for a very long time. And he describes how in the gulags, most prisoners became really beast-like. They started to behave in a truly beastly way. They were crushing each other's skulls during the night to steal each other's food or clothes. They became even worse for each other than the guards were already for them. And he described how a small percentage of the prisoners evolved in exactly the opposite way. How in this pool of darkness, they became more and more humane, and they became more and more, they preferred more and more to stick to certain ethical principles, to just make sure that there was like a small light of humanity in this pool of darkness. And Solzhenitsyn refers to this, to one prisoner in particular. I believe that his name was Ivanovich Grigoriev, I think. I refer to this guy in the last chapter of my book, who entered the concentration camps, the gulags, suffering from several medical conditions. He was rather sickly. But as soon as he arrived there, he refused to do things that went against his ethical principles in a very determined way. He refused to do anything that he considered unethical. When someone stole his food or his clothes during the night, he refused to steal clothes or food from someone else. When the guards commanded him to do something he considered unethical, he refused to do so, no matter what the punishment was, and so on. And Solzhenitsyn describes how this guy, throughout his stay in the gulags, became stronger and stronger, also physically.
Yes.
And that, Solzhenitsyn said that you can never understand something like that if you think in a materialist way or in a mechanist way, he said. But these things show us how important and how crucial principles are for the human being. And principles are not just rules or protocols we should follow. Its principles are something more. Principles are like a kind of guidelines that transcend every rational understanding, and that we can never articulate in a final way, in a definitive way. No, we should always reinvent them. We should try to stay in touch with them and reformulate them, reinvent them in every new situation. And being aware of principles is something we cannot learn. We will become aware of them. We will get in touch with them. If we are prepared to try to follow them, even if that means that we will lose things, that that we will lose certain possessions, a certain success in society, a certain social status, and so on. If we are prepared to sacrifice certain things in order to stay loyal to stick to certain ethical principles, we will become more and more firmly aware of them. We will feel more and more concretely in touch with them. And that's, I think, the future of society. That's also part of this new society, or this evolution we have to go through in order to really overcome the problems we are dealing with now.
I think that's perhaps the area where your book really stretches into kind of, you know, a new vision of what we might do about our situation. Because, you know, like Solzhenitsyn, when he in that situation, he conducted an inventory on himself, you know, to ask himself, you know, he went through his life and said, at what points had he behaved in a way that was counter to his own ethical. And he, you know, he tried to atone for these and to identify them. Now that's really interesting, because that isn't in any way or any sense, you know, trying to present yourself as any kind of ethical or moral person. It's simply an exercise for himself, which he believes is crucial for his own soul and his existence and his being, right? And this is something that I think an aspect of the religious experience and the religious life that we've lost completely is the idea that there's a purpose for it, you know, that it's real, that you're dealing with real things. It's not for show. It's not for, you know, to be seen to be good. It is to be genuinely good, because as Solzhenitsyn said, that the line of good and evil runs through the human heart, and that's something we need to be so conscious of, you know, that you know, a lot of these people, as you say, felt they were doing good. It's very hard to argue with people on the other side often, because they're convinced that they're good and you're bad.
They were so convinced that they would create paradise that they thought it was justified to kill millions of people for it. That's the mechanism that
This is a really, you know, I think difficult thing for us each of us to grasp, really, because, you know, we tend to assume that we're right about everything, or, you know, and to assume that the responsibility for everything lies elsewhere or with other people. But what your book is really saying, it's a challenge to us all to kind of look at this whole thing, this whole society, this whole culture, and ask ourselves, well, you know, how do I fit into it? How do I participate in it? Maybe I participate more willingly in this mass formation than I'm aware of, and so on and so on. So it's I think a really, really extraordinary book, and really timely. Can you tell us again what your next book is to be, Professor? Because I thought I just got a tentative kind of grasp of what it is, because it seems to follow on from where we are. Could you take us through that idea again?
Yes. Yes. Now I described in the Psychology of Totalitarianism, I described how the mechanist, rationalist view on men in the world led to social fragmentation and disconnectedness, and then to a fanatic belief in numbers and rational understanding, and how from this situation mass formation emerged ever stronger and stronger, and how it was this process of mass formation that made both a large part of the population and their leaders blind for the absurd characteristics of the narratives they bought into. And then I describe how the real solution for totalitarianism is exactly to overcome this mechanist view on man in the world. And I gave several examples how in what direction we might be able to overcome this view on the man in the world. In my next book, and I also what I announce in this in my last book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, is that it is the phenomenon of truth speech that should be the focus of or that can be the basis of a new kind of human living together, which will transcend the kind of society we are living in now and all the problems we are facing now. And in my next book, I want to really focus on this phenomenon of on the different ways in which a human being can use speech. And I will show that how throughout the last 200 years, society became more and more in the grip of indoctrination and propaganda. And the leaders of society were convinced that they needed indoctrination and propaganda, that there was no other option than to manipulate the population through indoctrination and propaganda for all kinds of reasons. That's one thing. I will describe how indoctrination propaganda emerged, how all kinds of technological machinery was created for indoctrination and propaganda, how even the media and the news, our educational system, in many respects, contribute to or examples of propaganda and indoctrination. And then I will contrast that. I will to truth speech, such as prophecy, wisdom, techne, and paresia, bold speech. And I will show how try to show how this other kind of speech, this truth speech, has a potential to be the basis of a new way of living together as a human being, how it also can offer an alternative of the transhumanist society that certain people want to create. Think about Yuval Harari, probably the most non-fiction writer of the most famous non-fiction writer of the moment, who wrote this book Homo Deus, in which he claims that the future of humanity will be transhumanist in nature, that humans are on the verge of becoming God, and how the control of information, of the streams of information, will be crucial to that project. Well, what he says actually is that a very sophisticated program of propaganda and indoctrination will create a new society. That's what he basically says. And I don't believe that. I believe that the opposite holds true, that we need a society based on truth speech, which is radically opposite to indoctrination propaganda, and which does not promise that man will become godlike or that man will become God, but to the contrary, which will bring people in touch again with a God that is very human. That's exactly the opposite. And well, I do believe that this transhumanist ideology is a real, well, that equals the radical destruction of all humanity in society, and
yeah.
it will never succeed. Of course, it will fail. This entire project will fail. But it is good that we think about an alternative, and then the better we understand what this transhumanist ideology actually is and what the limitations and the problems with it are, the more we see that the only future for humanity lies in a reappreciation and a new respect for the phenomenon of truth speech.
Yes, and because the transhumanism is really the culmination or the apotheosis of the mechanistic worldview.
Yes, it's a culmination point, yes.
And that's really the story beginning to end that we are in the midst of now. Yeah. Do you think, just as we finish, do you think that, what's your general feeling having watched this episode over the last 2 years? How do you feel it's panning out now? Is it tapering off? Is it in abeyance? Is it waiting? What do you think? Have we further to go down this road?
No, yes, I think that, well, the corona narrative disappeared a little bit in the background, but society is even more vulnerable now for new mass formations, just because the corona narrative and the corona mass formation led to the deterioration of the social bond even much more than it was already deteriorated before the corona crisis. It's very strange to see. Like now, students and personnel are allowed to come to university again everywhere, but they don't show up anymore. Only 5% shows up. The rest stays home, saying that in one way or another they lack the energy to leave their houses and to connect to other people again. So that shows exactly what I have been describing all the time, that a mass formation sucks all the energy away from the bonds between individuals and makes that they have no energy, that there's no energy left anymore to overcome the resistance that is always present in human relationships. So people prefer not to reach out to the other anymore and stay home. We've seen this at university, but also at the level of in all kinds of companies. People prefer to work from home and they don't reach out to each other anymore. So the problem is definitely not solved. We went through one episode of mass formation, but we see that society is very vulnerable for a new one. Think about the entire societal reaction to the war in Ukraine, in which you saw a little bit the same characteristics. Suddenly there was a new object of anxiety. There was this new intolerance for dissonant voices. There was this new lack of capability to talk, to open up, to listen to people with different opinions. We see the emergence of the narrative on the monkeypox now. Probably in a few months, the corona measures might return. Here in Belgium, our Minister of Health warns us now already that in a few months it will be necessary to revaccinate the population, and so on and so on. I don't think it will finish here, and I definitely don't think that the tendency towards technocracy will stop here. In Europe, we'll probably be confronted with the introduction of the digital ID, and also all the central banks are prepared to or at the verge of the introduction of digital coins. So the tendency towards technocracy will definitely not stop now. It will continue, I think. Nobody knows exactly how this will go, but we will see the evolution. We will see how throughout the years to come, how the democratic system is replaced more and more by a technocratic system, I think. And yes, that's so important. The most crucial thing is that we should continue to speak out. I repeat this time and time again. All kinds of totalitarianism is based on mass formation. Mass formation is a kind of hypnosis, and the only thing that can disturb the hypnosis is the sound of dissonant voices. And so we should continue to speak out in a quiet way, sincere way, not thinking that we are the only ones who know the truth. No, just saying like, look, to the best of my knowledge, this is what I think is going on, or I do not agree with mainstream opinion. We have to continue to speak out, because history shows us very clearly that it is exactly at the moment the dissonant voices stop to speak out that the cruelties start in a totalitarian system. Masses are always inclined to commit cruelties towards the people who do not go along with them, as if it is an ethical duty to do so, and they typically start to become so fanatically convinced at the moment the dissonant voices stop to speak out. And that's simply because at that moment the hypnotic state becomes so deep, people become so fanatically convinced that the people who do not go along with them are completely irrational and lack every kind of solidarity and citizenship, that they think it is justified to start to commit cruelties towards them. That started to happen in 1930 in the Soviet Union, in 1935 in Nazi Germany. Each time exactly a few months each time a few months after, the resistance or the dissonant voice stopped to speak out in public space and went underground. So we shouldn't do that. We should continue to speak out as well as possible, as sincere as possible, not because we think we will convince the other people and wake them up. No, not at all. We won't be able to convince them. That usually doesn't work. But that doesn't mean that we have no effect, because every time you speak out, you disturb the hypnosis a little bit. That's something that was very well described by Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century already.
Yes, and that's exactly the meaning of the title of Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless. That is the power of the greengrocer to remove the sign from his window. And for each of us to do those little things that will signal our refusal to engage in this, to participate in this. And that cannot be overestimated. You know, it's really a significant thing. And it resonates too with the Solzhenitsyn idea of, you know, that personal inventory, you know, that even if nobody knows about it in a paradoxical way, it becomes powerful by virtue of it having happened, having been done. You know, that little gesture you make, even in a private, is so important in your demeanor, in the world as you go out, the courage that you feel that you can walk tall in the midst of this horror. Thank you very much, Professor Desmet, for your time and this afternoon, and it's been really interesting. And I wish we had more time, and perhaps we can do it again sometime when maybe for your next book or whatever. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for listening, John.
Thank you.
Nice.
Bye.
Bye.